Hi, Diana. Can you hear me?
Hi, Sally. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you? You can hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you just fine.
Great, I can hear you great. How are things?
They're going well, actually. It's yeah, it's been a pretty good day. Can't complain.
Good.
How about you?
Going well.
How many
Nice to
people are we
finally meet you.
expecting tonight?
Um, we've had about 10 to 15 people register.
Great.
So we'll see. Here comes
Awesome.
somebody. So good. Good. People are showing up. We have tomorrow, Cody Carroll, one of our interns, is going to do a demonstration to people interested in CIOR of the Oyster Research Station that's on Tier Street. So this is great, introduction to what it is that they'll see tomorrow. So that's really helpful.
Cool. Super stoked. And
Great.
yeah, very excited.
Great. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Sally.
How are you? Nice to see you.
So far.
Good. Great. This is Diana Fu, our speaker for this evening.
All right. I'm looking forward to hear the talk.
Great.
And I'm not sure who's that there next. Who else is there?
With me?
Yeah, there's Ted. Next to you is Ted Port. Hi, Ted.
Hi, Sally.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Hi, Christina.
Hi, Sally.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
This is Diana Fu, everyone, who will be speaking tonight.
Oh, very nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet everyone. I'll be doing a more formal introduction when I start the presentation, but nice to see everyone on so early.
Diana, you graduated from Northwestern. My son is there.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
What year is he?
He's in his senior year.
Wow. Oh, wow. Senior year. I heard they, is he at home doing remote learning?
He is.
Yeah.
He is. It's real, a lot of people are a lot of his friends are not there. They all decide to sort of finish up at home. So.
Yeah. Oh,
I just had a guest speaker from Northwestern presenting in my class.
Oh, is that right?
Uh-huh.
Christina is a professor at NYU.
Oh, okay. Christina, what do you teach?
Weird stuff. Art conservation. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it's contemporary art and technology-based art. So artworks that contain electric and electronic components.
Very cool. So Sally, what is your son studying at NU?
He is studying, he's a double major in economics and classics.
Oh, he's a classics major. Wow. Yes. I took Latin in high school.
Did you?
I haven't been to a classics event in quite a bit, but that's very cool.
Yeah, he loves Latin. And he's doing his senior thesis on Seneca. So cool. He really loves it. Hi, Ellen.
Hi there. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. Good.
Hi, neighbor.
Hey. Hi. Russell's cooking, so he'll hopefully join us.
The man's place is in the kitchen. We know that. Yes.
Oh, yes.
Ellie, we were just chatting. Diana Fu is the speaker for this evening. She's on already.
Hi there.
Hi, Ellie. How are you?
Good.
Sally, I'm just going to mute and turn off my video just temporarily as I just get a couple of more things in line. Just let me know when you're ready to start, okay?
Sounds good. Ellie, you're going to join us at Barbara's house tomorrow?
Yes. I sent you You got it?
Got that? Yes.
We
That's
can talk
terrific.
about it tomorrow.
Exactly.
Okay, that's fine. Um, I'm muted right now. No, I'm muted.
You are not muted. I can hear you.
Yeah.
There you go. Christina, can I ask you, I know you're muted. Can I ask you a quick computer question?
Sure.
I have it recording to the cloud. Is that better than recording to my computer?
Both is fine. It usually takes a while. When you record it to the cloud, you have to download it to your computer again. It's either way is fine.
Okay. You can
Either way
talk.
is fine. And you can forward it to me afterwards. I'm happy to.
Thank you very much. Before, when I recorded it, was it to my computer? When we did it in the,
So because it creates a Zoom folder in your documents folder, and this is
Oh.
where the recording goes. It's usually an MPEG-4 file, an audio file, and I think a transcript from whatever was discussed in the chat window.
I see. So is it in the, going forward, is it easier for me if I store it on my computer versus on the cloud? Or is it 6 and 1/2 a dozen of another?
Go ahead and store it on your computer as well. This way it's safer probably, because you should technically also have a copy accessible through the cloud, I believe.
That's smart. Can I switch it now? I'm afraid, or can I change that now, or should I just leave this as is?
What's the time?
It is 7 o'clock.
7 o'clock sharp.
Let's just leave it. Okay.
Should be fine,
Okay. But in the future, I'll do it both.
just to be safe.
Good. So then we have a backup. Perfect.
Mhm.
Hi, Katie.
Hey there, how are you guys? So
Good. How are
excited for
you?
this. Good, good.
Thanks for joining us this evening.
Absolutely.
Diane, I think we can get started.
Okay, great.
I'm going to start with an introduction of you.
Sure.
Great. Just a couple of things to keep in mind during Diana's talk. If everyone would kindly mute themselves, and then at the end, there's going to be a question and answer period, and unmute yourself when you're speaking. That's always really helpful because we record this and then we will be putting it on the new CIOR website. And it makes it easier to hear the presentation if we're muted while she speaks. So nice of everyone to join us this evening. We're so fortunate to have Diana from the Billion Oyster Project here with us tonight to teach us about oyster research stations, what they are and what can be learned from them about our ecosystems. The Billion Oyster Project has been one of CIOR's key partners in moving forward in our mission to help clean the waters in the Eastchester Bay and around City Island through establishing oyster beds and involving the community by raising awareness about improving the environment. At the end of this summer, BOP, Billion Oyster Project, generously provided CIOR with four oyster research stations filled with close to 3,500 baby oysters that are growing in cages placed around City Island. This evening, Diana Fu is going to explain this important initiative, which is not only here on City Island, but throughout the waters around New York City. She is the Education Field Science Specialist for the Billion Oyster Project and oversees all matters related to the Oyster Research Station program. Diana's passion for the environment is demonstrated through her work. Before coming to the Billion Oyster Project, she was a community service coordinator at the Bronx River Alliance, which many of you are familiar with. There, she led service learning and citizen science projects with local community members and school groups. Diana earned her bachelor's in environmental science and Asian American studies from Northwestern University and has been awarded artistic fellowships and scholarships for her persuasive writing about the environment. We are so very pleased to have her here with us this evening, and now I'll turn it over to you, Diana.
Wow, that was a very lovely introduction. Thank you, Sally. Hi, everyone. My name is Diana. I am the Education Field Science Specialist here at Billion Oyster Project. First and foremost, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this evening. I know for many of us stuck at home, you may have been on screens all day for work or for school. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, taking time out of your day to listen to me talk about shellfish at the end of a very long day is just very appreciated. And yeah, thank you for being here. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have a presentation that I prepared. So I'm going to do that now. Alrighty. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right, I don't hear any objections. Okay, awesome. So tonight I will be talking about the Oyster Research Station program, which is the program that I oversee here at Billion Oyster Project. I see that some of my colleagues are here also this evening. Katie Mosher, she is the Director of Restoration, and Matthew Haken, he manages and oversees a lot of our grants. So, first, before we jump into oyster research stations, I did just want to do a brief, what even is Billion Oyster Project? Billion Oyster Project, or BOP, as many of us refer to it, is an ecosystem restoration and a public education project aimed at restoring a sustainable oyster population, reigniting a passion and appreciation for the New York Harbor, by directly restoring 1 billion oysters to the New York, New Jersey estuary system by 2035. So to date, we have put 30 million oysters back in the New York Harbor. Seems like a lot. It's really just about 3% of our goal. But, you know, in all fairness, BOP is a relatively new organization. It was founded in 2014 by Murray Fisher and Pete Malinowski, who really envisioned a healthy and biodiverse New York Harbor. And they also shared this belief that restoration without education is fleeting. So Murray currently continues to sit on our board of directors, while Pete serves as our executive director. Murray and Pete actually met at the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School, where Murray served as a director and Pete taught aquaculture, one of the school's career and technical education programs. So I've talked about Billion Oyster Project as an organization, but I can't talk about BOP without talking about the New York Harbor School, because the New York Harbor School is really where this idea for Billion Oyster Project grew out of. So the New York Harbor School was founded in 2003 as a career and technical education high school centered around maritime careers. It currently is based on Governor's Island and runs 7 different CTE programs that are listed here on this slide. So as you can see, the tracks or the programs that the students can choose from include aquaculture, professional diving, you know, marine systems technology, vessel operations. I know you guys can all read a slide, so I won't list them all. But it's just very exciting to have a specific public school in New York City that is dedicated to funneling young people into the maritime industry. So all incoming freshmen are required to take Harbor Class, which is an introductory course into the New York Harbor. And then their sophomore year, they choose a CTE program that they will then focus on for the rest of their high school career. And I want to talk about the students because the students are so critical in our work. And it's just super part and parcel to what we believe. We work with the New York Harbor School very closely. So for example, a lot of the structures that we put into the water, you know, the gabions that contain our oysters are welded by welding students at the New York Harbor School. They grow our algae to feed our oyster larvae. They manage and they fix the boats in our fleet. They dive to retrieve restoration structures. So when we talk about, right, you know, this intersection of restoration and education, it is baked into who we are. And it's something that we strongly believe that every single New York City school student, or really any New Yorker, should have access to, right? So now for the entree of tonight, we are talking about the Oyster Research Station. A lot of people ask me, what even is an Oyster Research Station? You know, if I'm gonna talk about it for 5 seconds, I would say it's an oyster cage that we monitor. But really the ORS is meant to be used as an educational tool for teachers and students and community scientists that want to study the New York Harbor through hands-on monitoring and scientific experimentation at the water's edge. So in addition to, you know, being an educational tool and an experimental tool, these small cages of oysters help serve as kind of pilot restoration projects, right? So we ask people to monitor ORSs for their own, you know, knowledge, you know, to teach students how to, you know, ask scientific questions, but they also serve a greater purpose for us as Billion Oyster Project. They really inform our team on, you know, what are the best places in the New York Harbor for large-scale oyster restoration. We currently have over 200 ORSs across the New York Harbor in every single borough, which is something we are very proud of. I know people tonight are, you know, mostly community members, but I also did want to mention that the ORS program does have a sister program, and that is called the Oyster Research Tank Program, where teachers, or really anyone, can adopt oysters in a tank in their home or in their classroom or place of work, and they can help us study oyster growth in a similar way. And, you know, many people look to us as experts on oysters. And it's true, we do know a lot of things about oysters, but there's also so much that we don't know about oysters. And the Oyster Research Station, as well as the Oyster Research Tank, are both tools that we use to invite people into this conversation and into this exploration of what oysters can do for the New York Harbor and other water bodies up and down the East Coast. And as you can see there in that photo, we have 2 students, I believe, holding an Oyster Research Station. They're pretty small. They're 18 inches wide, 8 inches high, 8 inches deep. They used to be actually a lot bigger. And they used to require several people to kind of haul over a railing or a boat, but you can see that we've simplified the design. And these cages, you can't buy them anywhere. They are fabricated by Billion Oyster Project volunteers and New York Harbor School students on Governor's Island. Right? Oh, and in each ORS, you may be wondering how many oysters are in there. There's approximately, I would say, 30 oyster clumps in each ORS, and I will be getting into what oysters and oyster clumps mean in just a moment. But before I get into that, you may also just be wondering, why oysters? Out of all of the animals that we could have focused on for restoring the New York Harbor, why did we pick oysters? They kind of look like rocks. They don't have faces. They're not cute and cuddly like, pandas are. If we're thinking about a symbol of conservation, why did we pick oysters? Well, oysters provide 3 main ecosystem functions for New Yorkers. First and foremost, they increase biodiversity in our waters by providing shelter and structure for other organisms. So like I mentioned in the past slide, right, oysters, when you get them on the restaurant, they're kind of on the half shell, right? It's, single oysters that are served to people at restaurants. Makes it easier to eat. But actually in the wild, oysters grow in clumps and in a reef-like fashion. They love sticking to each other. They're kind of like coral reefs in the sense that they are the basic foundation for all other types of harbor organisms to thrive. Also, for anyone who is unfamiliar with the New York Harbor at large, much of the harbor, consists of man-made shorelines, right? For anyone who's familiar with Lower Manhattan, all of that is filled in. So it's a lot of deep, straight drops into the water, and also a heavily sedimented bottom. And what that means is it doesn't provide a lot of critical infrastructure and shelter for, fishes and crabs and shrimp to hide and reproduce and to feed and thrive. So restoring oysters or oyster reefs means providing kind of like the building blocks for all of these other organisms to thrive. So that's the first reason. Oysters, first and foremost, increase biodiversity in our waters. And as you can see in those pictures, those are pictures that we've actually taken. Those are organisms that we have found in oyster research stations across the harbor. So if we're going clockwise, you can see that that's a oyster toadfish, a juvenile blue crab. We can see we have a red-beard sponge. And we see so many of these. Those are actually called sea grapes or sea squirts. So if you give those guys a little squeeze, they'll actually squirt water at you, which is why they're called sea squirts. All right. So I did want to talk about oysters' role in filtering our waters. It's something that, when I ask people, what do oysters do for us? I always get students that are like, oysters, they filter and they clean the water. And I'm like, whoa. Let's talk about that. Let's break that down a little bit. It's first of all important to note, right, that it's oyster reefs, not lone oysters that are, really doing this work of, cleaning the water. Oysters, they can actually help move nitrogen out of the water, and how they do that is they as I mentioned before, provide all this surface area, all this critical structure. Under the right conditions, they house these bacteria that live in the sediment actually under them. And under the right conditions, oyster reefs can speed up this process of those bacteria taking nitrogen where it's dissolved in the water. So you may have heard of things like nitrogen pollution or nitrogen runoff. as being a water pollutant. So these bacteria can actually take that nitrogen and turn it into nitrogen gas, which ends up in the atmosphere where it's pretty much harmless. So oftentimes when people think of oysters as cleaning or filtering the water, I just want to be very careful about what that language means. Oysters and the way that they eat algae, and the way that they eat is they open up a little bit, they take in a little sip of water, they sense what is food and what is not. And whatever isn't eaten is excreted as a kind of pseudo feces. And it's surrounded in this little bubble of mucus that the oyster creates. And that little bubble of, it could be sediment, it could be pollutants, it could be whatever, that is actually denser than the water around it, and it will sink to the bottom. So in that way, it seems like it is cleaning the water. But I just wanted to talk about that process for a bit, because something that, I as an educator really believe in is just being very clear about my language. I don't want to encourage any type of magical thinking that, matter can just exist and then disappear, right? We've all learned in school that matter can only change forms. It can't just disappear into thin air. So I did want to talk about that and get that out of the way. Moving on to the third reason of why oysters are so important for us New Yorkers. Oyster reefs do have the potential of protecting New York City from wave damage. And again, I want to be careful about my language, because, people will say, oh yeah, oysters can protect us from storm damage. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Oysters are not going to protect anyone from flooding per se. But if we had large and plentiful enough oyster reefs in the New York harbor, they could actually slow down waves to an extent that they could help people. So an example of that, for anyone who's familiar with the Chesapeake Bay, they've actually used what they call living shorelines. They've put in, these mesh bags of oysters, or oysters in other structures, along their shorelines. And you can actually search this up on Google. You'll see that the water that's coming in from the ocean, right, is pretty rough and choppy until it hits the oysters. And then after that, the waters are very calm. A similar project that we have here in New York City is called Living Breakwaters, and it's a project that BOP is partnering with governmental agencies with. And it's an example of a project that is probably going to be the smallest installation that could appreciably impact wave height. And if you want to learn more about living breakwaters, you can Google it. Or for any of you who ever take the Staten Island ferry, I realize it's far away from City Island, but if you're ever in the St. George ferry terminal on Staten Island, there is a huge installation or an exhibit about living breakwaters, and you can actually read up more in detail about that as you wait for the ferry. So those are the three main reasons why oysters are so important for New Yorkers. Okay, so now that I've got you hooked on oysters, I've got you hooked on the Oyster Research Station program, I want to talk a little bit about involvement. So, you're probably wondering now, how do I get involved? I know Sally has organized a more in detail session training, people in City Island on how to monitor oysters. So Sally, along with a couple of others, attended the basic ORS training that we offer on Governor's Island. I believe not too long ago, maybe last fall or last year. You can feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, Sally. But
It was the beginning of last summer.
Beginning of last summer, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we hold these trainings every so often. We usually do a cohort in the fall and a cohort in the spring to help, really rally in, New York City public school teachers. We currently do have some trainings additionally posted on Billion Oyster Project's Eventbrite. So if you know of anyone else in New York City who may not be, from City Island or affiliated with City Island Oyster Reef, you can tell them that we have trainings that are open right now and they can register for them. So that was the first step that's already been completed by City Island Oyster Reef. Next, after you've attended the training, you become eligible to receive and install an Oyster Research Station. So right now, we have over 50 permitted waterfront sites in the New York Harbor where you could install an ORS. I also just, wanted to mention that the reason why you can't just throw, in an oyster research station, or you can't just, throw in shells, at a location that isn't permitted is because the DEC is very concerned about people poaching oysters. And when I say poaching, I mean, taking up the cage, opening the cage, and then eating the oysters. So, oysters are delicious, I will say that, but people should not be eating shellfish out of the New York Harbor right now, just because the water just simply isn't clean enough. And you can learn more about this on the DEC's website. So I just wanted to put in that note in terms of if you're thinking about, going out to poach oysters, which I'm sure no one here would do. No one here would ever do. But in case you ever see anyone, poaching shellfish or harvesting shellfish from the New York Harbor, please say something. It is not healthy and it's not safe to eat just yet. All right. So I believe we installed the Oyster Research Stations earlier this fall or this summer. We're kind of in that in-between phase right now in terms of weather. And there are 4 ORSs located on City Island right now. So anyone who attends the basic ORS training and who has installed an ORS, they sign a participation agreement at those trainings that they will monitor their Oyster Research Station for at least a year, twice a year, and submit their data to the BOP education team. So as I mentioned before, right, there are a lot of things that we know about oysters, but there's also a lot of things that we don't know. And we invite people to submit that data so that we can learn together how oysters grow, how they thrive, and what they do for the New York Harbor. That data is also super critical for our educational initiatives, which is, not just exposing students across New York City to the New York Harbor, but also encouraging data literacy and critical scientific inquiry with our students. I just wanted to talk a little bit about ORS monitoring, and I'm sure you will hear about it more in detail. So as I mentioned before, we ask that anyone who participate in our programs monitor at least twice a year. And parameters could include one or more of the following. We always ask that people give us a mortality count. So counting how many oysters are dead or alive. We also ask that they measure the oysters so that we can track their growth. But there are other things that we're also interested in, such as, water quality. We want to know how, water quality is different across sites. Remember, we have over 200 oyster research stations across New York Harbor, and the water quality at each of those sites is going to vary depending, on the tide, on the day, etc. We're also really, really interested in the associated species with oysters. So as I mentioned before, the #1 reason why we want to restore oysters is because we want to increase the biodiversity of the New York Harbor. So actually my colleague, which you will see in the next slide, is working on a fantastic species ID guide that can be used by students and community scientists alike to help us identify and keep track of what kind of species we're seeing in the ORS. All right. So next, I just wanted to play a short video. This video was made by my colleague, Agata Poniatowski, and she is also the one behind the Species ID Guide that will be coming out very, very soon, I believe this fall or this winter. And I'm just going to go ahead and play the video and mute myself so we can all watch.
Hi everyone, my name is Agata Poniatowski. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator here at the Billion Oyster Project. And we're here at the Brooklyn Navy Yard today. We're going to be monitoring cage number 47. So I'm just going to pull it out of the water and we'll see what's inside. So I need my ORS kit. Most of the ORS kits are actually located on Governor's Island right now, so I'm going to work with what I have, but we're going to check out if we see any fish or any cool critters inside. Ooh, it's a right, so I've separated our Oyster Research Station after we've poured water all over it. You can see the water that's accumulated from the cage over here. But for now, I'm gonna open up the cage and see if there's any fish or anything like that I'll show you. Well, so first of all, I already see a lot of this creature called a sea squirt. So a sea squirt kind of looks like a small udder. If you look at these guys closely, you can see they have two siphons, one to take water in and one to take water out. All right, take a look at what happens when I poke it. Did you see that? Let's try another one. Oh my God, there it goes. Did you see that? That's called a sea squirt. Let's open up this Oyster Research Station and see what's inside. Whoa, check this out. Look at that beautiful tin kit. Look, they're so beautiful. This one even has some yellow in it. All right, let's check out our oysters. So this one looks dead already, right? Because it's open. It doesn't have an organism inside. This one also looks dead already because it doesn't have two shells. One shell just came off. But these guys look pretty healthy. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 healthy oysters here. That's looking good. I'm going to put them to the side here so we can measure them a little bit later. Great. All right. These look like healthy oysters. They're a bit muddy, but that's okay. So we have 1 live oyster here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the small one here, 7. 7 live oysters on this cluster. Check this out. We have 2 blackfish in here. I'm going to save them in a second. So we have a blackfish. We're going to put him in the tank so he can swim around. Look at him, he's so happy. Okay, next. Good. Okay. Ooh, ooh. All right, all right, all right, all right, all right. There you go. Great. I'm gonna take the bubbler out just so you guys can see the fish a little better. So, these are blackfish. There's 4 of them. They're really small. Blackfish can grow up to 1 foot. And you see how they're all kind of like sideways, kind of curled up or lying down flat? So that's a behavioral trait of a blackfish. Since these guys really love swimming near our oyster reefs, they have to have the ability to curl up next to our oysters because our oysters grow in a 3D fashion. So when these guys are swimming around our oyster reefs, they curl up and they actually hang out just cuddled up to an oyster or even another fish. You see them doing that? They're all clustering like that. Now it's time to measure our oysters. I've selected random oyster clusters here, and we're going to be using a caliper. Right? A caliper is similar to a ruler, but the cool thing is it has these claws, and you can actually measure your oyster using the claw. Alright, so whenever you're measuring your oyster, you have to measure.
Hello? Did everyone else cut out, or is that just me?
I'm back in. I cut out for a little bit.
Okay, no worries. I'm going to share my screen again. Was everyone hearing the video okay? Just want to make sure. Okay, got some nods.
Yep.
Very good.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Alrighty here. Back in.
It's got oysters all over the place. So it might not be so easy to measure all of the oysters in the cluster. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to choose this guy, who's kind of tough to get to, right? My claws of the caliper won't really fit around him. So what's really amazing is that you could actually use this side of your caliper to measure your oyster as well. It's the same measurement here as it would be between the claws. All right, let's take a look. So inside, I have to measure from the bone to the top of the oyster. Okay. And whenever we're monitoring our oysters, we need to make sure that we're monitoring them in millimeters. And then I'll check out this baby guy just because he's super cute. Look at that. This could be a baby oyster in our latest recruitment, which means our oysters spawned, and this guy could be about a year old. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed monitoring for organisms in our Oyster Research Station. I'm going to put this back in our harbor, and I hope you guys have a great week. Bye, everyone.
All right, so I hope that got everyone excited a little bit for monitoring a Oyster Research Station. Agata had made that video in April, and if you all remember, April was pretty cold this year actually, so hopefully it'll be nicer weather when you're out there monitoring. So cool. As I mentioned before, all of the data that Agata was showing us, using the calipers, showing us the organisms, all of that data is submitted at least twice a year to BOP. And what we like to do with that data, if we go to the next slide, is actually encourage students to use that data and attend our annual Billion Oyster Project Research Symposium, which we hold every year, June on Governor's Island. And it's a place where you can come to share your scientific findings with, other community scientists, students, and teachers. I just wanted to make note that this past June, because of quarantine and shelter in place, we did have a virtual symposium. And we got over 70 different student projects, which we are super proud of and showcased on our website. And if you're ever interested in seeing what our students are up to, our future scientists of the world, you can check it out in the blog section of the Billion Oyster Project website. I did want to talk a little bit about the BOP Research Symposium. Like I said, it's usually held June on Governor's Island every year. It's not actually only scientific research. We actually also accept research in other categories like activism and engineering and design. What that could look like. Students in the past have submitted, for example, like ORS 3.0, an improved version of the ORS, giving us engineering designs, things that, they could envision the ORS to look like for it to serve a different research purpose. For activism, we've had students submit projects where they've done surveys asking people, do you believe in climate change? Or are you aware that, there are plastics in our oceans, that there's plastics in our table salt? So these are all projects that people bring to the Billion Oyster Project Research Symposium. We also love the fact that we have guest judges from the New York City area. There are people from the DEC, there are people from Hudson River Park Trust, a lot of our partners or partner organizations in the New York City area will come to Governor's Island to review these student projects in person, I strongly invite all of you to volunteer and become a guest judge. It is, I would have to say, you know, before I joined BOP, I was working at the Bronx River Alliance, and I actually, you know, went to Governor's Island for the first time as a guest judge for Billion Oyster Project. At that point, I had no background knowledge about, you know, what Billion Oyster Project was doing, but I do remember getting on the ferry, you know, being surrounded by so many students, and, you know, just hearing them talk about how excited they were to present their research. And then, you know, going into it, I wasn't sure what to expect, right? You know, we have students who are in the first grade or second grade presenting research. And then we have students who are, you know, finishing up their high school career, moving into college, presenting their research as well. And it was just such a cool space to be in, as someone who is, you know, an advocate for the New York Harbor, you know, advocate for the Bronx. I used to live in the Bronx. So it was just really, really, really cool to see that. And I strongly, strongly encourage all of you to volunteer in that way if that interests you, right? So that's, you know, pretty much the Oyster Research Station program. You know, attend the training, install the ORS, monitor the ORS, which I hope you all get involved in, and then attending the research symposium, which I also invite and encourage all of you to come next June. So at this point, I did want to show you one last video. I'm going to make it full screen here. This is actually a video of oyster larvae. On the left-hand side, that's actually what it looks like to the naked eye, those tiny little black specks, if you can even see them. And then on the right, you can actually see those oyster larvae moving around under a microscope. It's pretty cool. I also just wanted to mention, a lot of people are like, well, you know, oysters, they're sessile organisms, they don't move. And actually at the beginning of their life, they actually do swim around in the water. So you saw them, you know, kind of shaking around under the microscope. They move around with this little foot. I don't know if people are actually looking at my video right now or looking at the slide, but I'm doing this motion with my hand where, you know, they kind of move around with this little foot and they swim in the water like this. And then when they're ready, they attach onto a substrate. And most of the time they prefer things that are calcium bicarbonate based, which, you know, are things like oyster shells, clam shells, things like that. But I have seen the occasional oyster choose concrete as their forever home. So you never know. All right. Last but not least, just, you know, that's my contact information for anyone who has any questions and wants to contact me directly. That's my email right there. For anyone who's interested in, you know, seeing what we're up to, what kind of events we're hosting, you can use that link right there. I'm going to put my cursor over it, bit.ly/Billion Oyster Events. We have, you know, our educational programs there, but we also have a lot of fundraising events. We do have the Billion Oyster Party coming up, and you can find out more about that on our website. I just wanted to come inside. That's basically the ORS program. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Oh, what are you gonna watch?
I will take questions. If people have questions, you can type them in the chat, or maybe Sally, you can moderate the conversation and pick on people.
Sounds great. Does anyone have any? First of all, Diana, thank you so much for your presentation and incredibly accurate, you know, presentation on the ORS cages, which we're all very curious about, especially since all of our juveniles arrived at the end of the summer. So it's really helpful to see the visual videos and to hear what you had to say. And you, again, were really accurate in your description of what they're about and what they can do for the water. So any questions out there? Christina?
I want to join Sally in thanking you, Diana, for a wonderful presentation, great visuals. It was really a joy to learn from you. I have one specific question which you may or may not have mentioned. I got pulled away, so I simply don't know, and I'm a little embarrassed to ask, but I'm curious to learn about the time frame that you set over the year for the monitoring of your cages. Is this, do you do it all year round, or do you define it from like April to November? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, yeah. So the bare minimum to participating in the Oyster Research Station program, right, is to monitor and submit the data twice a year. When you do that is up to you. You know, here at Billion Oyster Project, the way we work with New York Harbor School students, we encourage people to go out to the water all times of the year. I know it can be very rough in the winter, but it's something that we instill in our students, especially our harbor class students. You know, I mentioned the freshmen taking that introductory course. Really exposing them to the weather and the climate at all stages of the year is something that we really believe in. But of course, you know, the typical recreation season for New York is, I'd say, like May to October. And it's totally fine if you want to take those two measurements between May and October as well. It's really up to you. I will say that oysters grow fastest in the summer months when the waters are warm. And in the winter time, you know, like all organisms, their metabolism will slow down and their growth, you know, shrinks in the winter.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have a question?
Yeah.
Russell?
Question. So, you know, you didn't mention it, but I heard that oysters were good at taking heavy metals and hydrocarbons out of the water. Is that something they do to trap them into the reef? Materials like that? Very good presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, I've heard, you know, you're not the first person to ask me that. And I'm wondering, because Katie is our director of restoration, if I can defer to Katie. If Katie's still there.
Hey, yep, I'm here. So I have some good research papers that I can share that some of you may know Allison Mass because she's presented for you guys as well. But Allison spent a lot of time studying the uptake of oysters and how they may or may not store different metals. I think particularly she looked at copper. And she studied that over at Soundview, which is not too far from you guys. So I can try to dig that paper up and share that with you all. But I think primarily you would see, you know, certain types of metals possibly being stored in tissue and certain types possibly being incorporated into shell. But oysters, I think as Diana said earlier, are primarily feeding in the water column where you find a lot of those metals and legacy toxins actually already in the sediment, unless there's been some kind of sediment disturbance.
Yeah, I just wonder what's coming down the Hutchinson River.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think, you know, when things get rough because of storms or if there's different types of activity on the bottom, that may stir up sediment, and that's certainly a concern with things like PCBs coming down the Hudson or as you said, in the Hutch.
Thanks, Katie, for being fast on your feet. And certainly, you know, as I mentioned before, I'm sure many of you know that there are many impaired water bodies in New York City: the Hutch, Bronx River, Gowanus. You know, I could go on and name them all. So very important to remember, do not eat the shellfish.
Diane, I was curious about the blackfish. My understanding is that they're sort of on the rare side. They're protected somewhat. Do you find that through your use of the ORS, is because you're mentioning the blackfish are very attracted to oysters and oyster beds. Are you finding that there are more blackfish around now?
You know, I don't have a point of comparison to what it may have been like pre-BOP, but I will say I find that blackfish are actually one of the most common fish that we see in the Oyster Research Station. My understanding is that they're actually pretty tolerant of polluted waters, and that's one of the reasons why we see them over other fish that may be more sensitive to pollutants like pipefish, or I don't know, there's, in the species ID guide, there are so many species of fish that we could potentially find in the New York Harbor in the future, and maybe now. But by and large, I feel like blackfish is probably the most common fish that I see.
Does anyone else have a question? And just curious, with the training that BOP does, can high school students be involved in your ORS training, or is there a certain age cutoff?
We don't have an age cutoff, and I think that is because we've never had, you know, a second grader be like, I want to go to training. But we have had high school students attend trainings in the past, and they've done, you know, their high school scientific research or independent research after they've attended the training. So yeah, I highly recommend high school students coming.
Sounds great. Any other questions? Or Christina?
I mean, since we have Diane here, I just
Yes.
stop myself.
Yes,
In
good.
case you answered this already, I apologize again, but it's my understanding that spat is considered an oyster being 1.5 centimeters or less. Is that correct?
So we've kind of designated that just on our protocols and our data sheets because, you know, spat being less than 15 millimeters is really hard to measure, and they're very sensitive at that life stage. You may have noticed when you first got the oysters in your ORSs up in City Island that, you know, even if you took out one of the shells and you can see a lot of spat, those little baby oysters on them, if you even poke them a little too hard, they might dislodge from the shell. So that's why, you know, for people who are unfamiliar, spat is the life stage after the free swimming larvae. When they attach on, that's when they're called spat. That's when they're babies. And then after that, you know, they grow. I mean, we used, you know, informal terms like a juvenile oyster to say, you know, the oysters that are still growing really fast. But really, you know, oysters reach, I think, sexual maturity around 2 to 3 years.
And what would be your expected growth rate from spat, let's say within a year? What would you expect? What's the growth be that is an average juvenile growth after a year?
That's a really great question. And I think it depends on where you are in the harbor. I also think it depends on the specific water temperature and what that year is looking like. Again, like I mentioned, you know, oysters grow much more in the warmer months. So some of the spat that we handed out, or that we as BOP, we have our own oyster research stations that we monitor down in Williamsburg. Some of those oysters now, when we first installed them, you know, the tiny little specks, those little spat. And now they're actually, you know, you can actually measure them. I would say they're maybe 20 to 30. So that's quite, you know, a fast rate of growth, but, you know, it's been a warm summer. Oh, there was something else I wanted to say, but I forgot. Oh, the other thing, you know, I mentioned, you know, different parts of the harbor. There's a lot of things that could affect oyster growth. And, you know, this is one of the many things I don't know about oysters. But what I do know is that oysters, you know, tend to thrive in waters with higher salinity. Again, you know, what the exact rate is, not sure. There are also other factors like disturbance, right? So I think, you know, I was talking to Sally and Cody, the intern, about disturbing the ORS. There are places where we place ORSs where the water is, there's just a lot of energy in the water, you know, whether that be harbor traffic, whether, you know, that means it's the current that's bumping it against, you know, a concrete bulkhead, you know, all these things affect how well the oysters are doing in terms of growth and mortality.
Thank you so much.
So helpful. It's also relevant to us because of these cages we have now. Another question, back to like how sensitive they are when they're young. And I know you cautioned Cody and our group to not over monitor them at the beginning because it may do damage to the juveniles. So at what age or what size are they secure enough where you can do more frequent monitoring?
Several things about younger oysters. I tend to be more on the sensitive side with the smaller oysters. Like I mentioned before, you know, when they're super young and you poke them, they could totally just, you know, that's it for them.
Right.
But, you know, I would say the older that they get, the hardier they are. That's typically
Right.
the rule. I would say, and people ask me too, because, you know, obviously New York is tidal, you know, pre, you know, European colonization, where there were all of these oyster reefs in the harbor naturally, there was a lot of oyster reef that was just naturally exposed outside of the water at different times of the year or different times of the day. And I would say the smaller oysters are just more sensitive in general, whether that be to disturbance, to temperature, the amount of time that they're out of the water. Once the oysters, I guess, reach around, I mean, you know, if they're bigger than a dime, let's say they're around the size of a quarter, still pretty sensitive. Like you don't want to leave them out of the water for more than a couple of hours, especially if it's a hot day, right? Like I mentioned, when it's hotter, organisms, you know, their metabolisms are just faster and, you know, it's decomposition, you know, right? That's also why people keep oysters on ice so that they can slow down that metabolism, keep them alive. But oysters, you know, when you think of some of those oysters that Agata in the video was handling, some of those bigger ones, I would say those you could probably actually, you know, keep out of water like in the 30s around, you know, for 24 hours. So with some of the bigger oysters, when we hand them out to participants, for example, if I, you know, were to take oysters out of the water and I had to meet a school group the next day to install their Oyster Research Station, those oysters and a little smaller, I would take out of the water, stick them in my fridge overnight, and I'd still be good in the morning. I don't know if that answers your question. A lot of these things are like, we don't know.
I see. So we have to watch them and see when we have a sense that they're not so.
I would watch them, and
just watch them. Yeah.
And I'm curious because we've never had oyster research stations up at City Island, so
Okay.
it could be very different up there versus, you know, Brooklyn Navy Yard where Agata was in the video.
Okay. Anyone else? I think that's it. Diana,
Okay.
it's been really helpful and it's so informative and so relevant for us since we have our 3,500 babies and we want to take good care of them and monitor them accurately. And that's important to us. So we really appreciate your time and all that you've done for our group and all that Billion Oyster Project has done for us. We're so grateful.
No problem, and it's been a pleasure. I hope, you know, you all have fun monitoring. Please, please, please send me photos. I mean, you know, I'm always like, send me data, but also photos because I
Absolutely.
love seeing people just having fun with oysters and being out on the water. Brings me great joy.
We certainly will. Thanks again, Diana.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you very much.